Good evening. Thank you for joining us for a joint event of the annual Northwood University Freedom Seminar and our university-wide Omniquest program. The annual Freedom Seminar is a showcase event for the Northwood idea, Northwood's institutional philosophy that recognizes the importance of personal freedom, individual responsibility, earned success, ethical leadership, personal property, the rule of law, and free enterprise. For the past 47 years, the Freedom Seminar has featured community leaders, business professionals, and distinguished scholars. The Freedom Seminar invites us all to explore the interdisciplinary ideas that empower free societies and drive human progress. Omniquest is a university-wide program which invites the entire Northwood community to engage with thought-provoking books each year that challenge us to think differently about freedom, enterprise, and our roles as responsible leaders. Our fall 2025 selection, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, is aligned with our focus on the foundations of the Northwood idea. This work, co-authored by Deirdre McCloskey and tonight's distinguished guest, Carden, argues that it wasn't material forces or political decrees that propelled the world into modern prosperity, but rather ideas about liberty, innovation, and respect for the creativity of ordinary people. Liberalism and innovism elevated the innovator, the entrepreneur, and the risk taker, leading to dramatically improved global living standards and expanded human flourishing. We are honored to welcome Carden, a leading economic historian and one of the foremost voices examining how cultural change and economic liberty combine to drive prosperity. He is the Margaret Gage Bush Distinguished Professor of Business and a Medical Properties Trust Fellow at Samford University, as well as co-editor of the Southern Economic Journal. In addition to Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, he is the author of Strangers with Candy and Mere Economics, and his scholarship continues to shape international conversations about economic development, markets, and human progress. This evening, he will guide us through the idea that when society grants ordinary people the freedom and dignity to innovate, create, and trade, extraordinary things happen. Following his presentation, Dr. Dale Matchek, professor and department chair of economics and the longest-serving director of the Northwood University Freedom Seminar, will moderate a Q&A. Please be sure to keep your questions, take notes on your questions. We invite all of you joining us in the room and online to share your questions at that time. And now, please join me in welcoming this evening's Omniquest and Freedom Seminar keynote speaker, Carden.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. Good evening. It is an honor to be invited back to Northwood. I was here a couple of years ago to talk about this book and some of the projects related to it. And I use the recording from that in my classes. I'll probably use the recording from this in my classes as well. And to sum it up, the argument that Deirdre McCloskey and I make in this book is basically that the Northwood idea is what led to the rise of the Western world, has effectively made poverty history, and will continue to make poverty history if we tend to embrace it a little bit more. We wrote the book, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, How the Bourgeois Deal Enriched the World, to summarize Deirdre McCloskey's 3-volume set on what she calls the bourgeois era. And in order to extend this a little bit more, and then also to set the stage for future inquiry that we might do into how exactly it is that ideas and not material forces and things like that change economic possibilities and change people's lives. So we're going to go a couple of different places here. First, we'll talk a bit about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, one of the truly great contributions to American cinema. Second, we'll talk about a big difference in the things that do explain it, the things that don't explain it. Third, we'll talk a bit about the things that do explain it. And then we'll talk about where we go from here in the year 2025 in light of what we know about the relationship between the bourgeois deal or the Northwood idea and long-run economic progress. Where do we go? Where do we go? What do we do? What are the practical upshots? So here's a question. I mentioned Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Like I said, one of the truly great contributions to the American screen. And in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, you have two slackers named Bill S. Preston, Esquire, and Ted Theodore Logan. They live in San Dimas, California in the year 1988. They have a band called Wild Stallions, and they have a history report that they have to do. And the history report is on what people from throughout history would think about life in San Dimas, California in the year 1988. Why this matters is that in the movie, Bill and Ted and their band, Wild Stallions, are going to create the music that will usher in nirvana, that will usher in utopia, that will end war, that will create widespread shared prosperity and peace. If they fail their history report, Ted gets sent to a military academy in Alaska. Their band Wild Stallions has to break up, and the future is ruined. So the people from the future send the comedian George Carlin, playing a guy named Rufus, back to 1988 in a magic phone booth. Then he and Bill and Ted travel throughout history, and they pick up a bunch of great characters: Billy the Kid, Sigmund Freud, Ludwig van Beethoven, Abraham Lincoln, Genghis Khan, Joan of Arc, Socrates, and they bring them all back to San Dimas, California in 1988. They give the report, they get an A on it, the future is saved. So my question for you is, if you had a project like that you had to do, and you had to bring back some great figure from history like Joan of Arc, and show that great figure from history like Joan of Arc how radically different our lives are in 2025 from her life centuries ago, or from Socrates' life millennia ago, where would you take them? Where, in short, should Bill and Ted take Joan of Arc in the year 2025 to show them how life in Midland, Michigan, or Birmingham, Alabama is so radically different from the world that Joan of Arc lived in? So I'm going to ask you guys, where should Bill and Ted take Joan of Arc? Okay, you see a hand? Yes, sir.
Las Vegas.
Las Vegas. Las Vegas. I love Las Vegas. I love Las Vegas. If you have or have had a class with Dr. Takarev, we spoke this morning about how he and I first met about 20 years ago, sharing a room at a conference in Washington, D.C., and then later that academic year at a first conference in Las Vegas, or at a conference in Las Vegas, the first time I'd ever been there. Vegas is great. Why Vegas?
I think it's really America boiled down.
Okay.
Good picture.
Yes, there are few things that are as Americanly America as Las Vegas. I love Las Vegas. The last couple of times I've been, it's really been it's starting to get it's losing its charm a bit, but it is where the height of human creativity meets the absolute depths of human depravity. That's how I would describe Las Vegas. Okay, so that's a pretty good example. That's a pretty good example. And in the book, you might remember, we talk about how people spending money at the Luxor will build a pyramid, okay, whereas nobody in their right mind would have voluntarily contributed to the building of a pyramid for the pharaoh. Okay, so that's a good answer. Where else? Where else would you take Joan of Arc? Okay, now Las Vegas is not in Midland. It's not in Birmingham. Where would you take Joan of Arc? In or near Midland, or in or near Birmingham, to show her how radically different our lives are from hers? Yes. Dow Chemical. Okay, why Dow Chemical? Okay. Okay. Seeing the amount of stuff that people are able to produce at a place like Dow using processes that, to Joan of Arc, would be fundamentally indistinguishable from witchcraft. Okay. That's pretty cool. Where? Where else? Meyer. Meyer is a great answer. Meyer is a great answer. Why Meyer?
Well, we have no idea what that is.
Okay.
When Joan of Arc was living, she was
Ah, okay. Okay. So for the better part of history, if you wanted food, you had to kill it yourself. Or you had to have flunkies and servants to do so for you. Today, if you want food, you just go to Meyer. Okay. Or you just go to Costco, or you just go somewhere else. The specific place I'm thinking of, and Meyer's a perfectly acceptable answer in Midland, Michigan. The specific place I'm thinking of is a Walmart Supercenter. Okay. Walmart Supercenter. So Meyer, again, is a perfect answer for being right here. And the reason why, and I was thinking about this while I was walking around at my local Walmart, or I've thought about this when I've walked around in a Meyer before. It is a truly and genuinely amazing place, stacked floor to ceiling with goods of all different kinds and all different varieties, unlike anything that Joan of Arc or anyone in her era could have possibly imagined. But the most remarkable thing about Walmart, and the most remarkable thing about Meyer, is not necessarily the stuff that they carry, but their clientele, the people that they serve. You go to a Meyer, or you go to a Walmart, you're not going to be surrounded by the descendants of royalty. Okay, definitely if you go to a Walmart. Okay. You're not going to be surrounded by members of the party's central committee. You're not going to be surrounded by powdered lords and ladies. You're going to be surrounded by people of relatively modest means who can, for trivial amounts of effort, have access to, once again, absolutely unbelievable and unbounded amounts of stuff. The miracle of the modern world, what the bourgeois deal created, is a world where even the poor have access at the Irondale Walmart or at a Midland Meijer to goods unlike anything that our ancestors could have possibly imagined. One of the most remarkable facts about the modern world is that one of the biggest problems facing the poor in the United States today is obesity. Think about that for just a second. One of the biggest problems facing poor people today is not that they're starving to death, but they have access to too many low-quality calories. That's incredible. Bill and Ted, I would argue, would take Joan of Arc to Meijer in Midland, Michigan, or would take Joan of Arc to Walmart in Birmingham, Alabama, or has Buc-ee's made it this far north yet? Okay, it's trying. How many of y'all have been to a Buc-ee's? Oh, God bless America. No, I actually, while Dr. Benzacree was in grad school, I think you might have actually been at the talk. Someone asked me, I talked about this a little bit. Someone said, "Hey, where would you take? What would you show somebody to convince them that we're so much richer?" I'd say, "Take them to Buc-ee's. Take them to Buc-ee's." A few years ago, we stopped at the Buc-ee's in Sevierville, Tennessee, on the 4th of July. I did not know it was possible to America that hard, and I defy anyone to go into a Buc-ee's and not immediately conclude that this is the greatest civilization the world has ever produced, and it's not particularly close. Okay. So Walmart, Meijer, honorable mention for Buc-ee's, and Buc-ee's might take first place here in a few years. We live in a world, though, of what we might call forgettable miracles. Okay? We live in a world of what we might call forgettable miracles. There's an enormous amount of stuff that happens that is, in a very real, well, not a very real sense, but in a seeming sense, miraculous, insofar as there are all of these little bits and pieces of cooperation that have to happen and have to happen just right in order for us to have access to the goods and the services and things like that that we can get at Meijer or Buc-ee's or Walmart or wherever. I was thinking about this yesterday. I live in Birmingham, Alabama. 24 hours ago, I was at an airport. The number of things that had to go right for me to get here and the number of people who were involved is genuinely mind-boggling. Planes had to make it from one place to another. Turned out my flight from Birmingham to Detroit was delayed. Uh-oh. Flick, flick, flick with my thumb on the Delta app. And I've got a refund on the Detroit to MBS part of the trip. Pull up the Hertz app. I've got a rental car I can pick up in Detroit. Okay, again, all sorts of people, all sorts of products, all sorts of technologies, all sorts of things that have to go right for me to be here. This is all, again, stuff that we once again just sort of take for granted. You take for granted that you can go to Meijer and get basically anything you could possibly want. You take for granted that you can go to Walmart Supercenter and get basically anything you could possibly want. The average Walmart Supercenter carries 150,000 stock keeping units, which is basically 150,000 discrete different goods. Walmart.com carries something like 400 million. We're so rich, and the bourgeois deal has made cooperation so very, very, very easy and extended it so very, very far that we frequently take it for granted. Now then, if you're the praying type, or if you prayed over Thanksgiving, you might have heard someone pray a prayer something like, "God bless this food and the hands that prepared it." We've heard someone pray, like, "Bless this food and the hands." Okay, good. Heard the hands that prepared it. Man, that's a lot of hands, if you really think about it. Okay, yeah, sure. So I made stuffing for the first time ever last week, Wednesday. We had a bunch of extra bread because we screwed up our shopping. Thought, okay, what the heck? Let's try to make stuffing here. So I take the bread. It gets, my wife cubes it, and we dry it up, and we pour in like mushrooms and sausage and a bunch of other things. So sure, my hands prepared the stuffing insofar as I assembled the resources here and made it all work, but there's a lot of other hands too. The guy who raises the pigs that got slaughtered to turn into the sausage that eventually became part of the stuffing. The people who grew the mushrooms that I bought at Aldi. The guy who's filling out purchasing reports at Aldi so that they have mushrooms when I need them, so that I can cut them up and so that I can cook them and put them in stuffing. The person at the natural gas company who probably doesn't know me, probably doesn't care about me, may not even like me if we met, who's nonetheless making sure that my natural gas works so that I can saute the mushrooms and saute the onions, and so that I can open the oven, put the stuff in the oven, and out comes stuffing. Okay. We live in a world of what we might call forgettable miracles. One of my goals as an economist, and in the books I've written, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, Strangers with Candy, and most recently a book called Mere Economics, is to help people see the miraculous in the mundane. And here, when we talk about miraculous, this is what we mean. What happened? What happened? I saw someone on Twitter recently write that the only event in history that really matters is the Industrial Revolution. The only event in history that really matters is the Industrial Revolution. Now, granted, it's Twitter. So this person is speaking a little bit hyperbolically. I do think, as we celebrate Advent, that there are a couple of other things that have happened in history that are probably a little bit more important than the Industrial Revolution. But to take the person's point, almost all human progress has happened in the last couple of centuries. Here, we've got a graph of GDP per capita from roughly the time of Christ through today. This is in 2011 prices. And you see that the amount of output per person in the world was pretty darn close to zero for almost 17 or 1800 years. Then it explodes upward. There are a lot more people in the world, about 8.5 million of us. We produce a lot more stuff per person. We live a lot longer. Life expectancy in the United States today is pushing 80. Life expectancy in the richest countries in the world, right around, say, here-ish, would have been like 40. I'm 46, so ever since I passed like 1800s life expectancy, I've been thinking about how I'm living on borrowed time in a certain sense. There's a lot more of us. We live much richer. We produce much more stuff. We live a lot longer. We can read. We can write. We have access, once again, to opportunities to flourish unlike anything that our ancestors could have possibly imagined. So, as I told one of the classes earlier, anyone who complains about kids these years, or who talks about the quote-unquote good old days, is probably wrong factually. Your grandparents who are complaining, by God, in my day, we didn't sit around playing video games all the time. We played outside. It's not because they had video games and chose, because they're morally better people, to play outside. They didn't have video games. They didn't have access to Super Mario Brothers 3, which is, in my mind, the greatest video game ever created. They didn't have access to all the stuff that my kids spend their time playing. Okay? They didn't have access to all of these things that make our lives so absolutely wild and so absolutely incredible and so absolutely filled with abundance. So what we want to do in Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich is we want to try to explain why all of this stuff happened, why it didn't happen. That, we think, is the question in the social sciences. And we also want to try to evaluate, to a certain extent, the question in the humanities, which is it good? So to recap, there's one question in the social sciences, I think, that matters. And that question is, why are people in some places very rich while people in other places are very poor? My economics students at Samford, both in my intermediate and principles of macroeconomics classes, are going to have to write essays on the final exam explaining just that. The question in the humanities is it good? Is our life good? Yeah, sure, we're rich, but have we gained the world and lost our soul? Well, what I want to do now is answer the social science question about the things that caused it. There are some things that caused it that were really, really nice to have, but not enough necessarily to explain why people in some places are very rich, while people in other places are very poor. There are also some bad things that sometimes get blamed, or sometimes get credited with the rise of the West and the increase in standards of living that we enjoy today in countries like the United States. I'll talk about those here in just a second. Then we'll do some evaluation and talk about kind of where we go from here. But first, I want to say a couple of words about the good things, the things that are nice to have that didn't cause it. And we go through this kind of point by point and ask, of all of the possible explanations for increases in standards of living, let me kind of go back to the slide here. What among the posited explanations could explain an increase of this magnitude? Okay. What could explain an increase of this magnitude? Going from, say, $1,000 a year in per capita income to $50,000 a year, a factor of 50, or as we explained in the book, globally, an increase of anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500% in per capita income. And again, there's a lot of cool stuff, a lot of great stuff to have, a lot of things that contributed at least a little bit, but that don't do the explanatory work. If we're trying to explain, say, a tenfold increase in standards of living, 5% here, 6% there are not going to be sufficient to get the job done. So in the book, we go through a bunch of different explanations. I'll highlight a few. One is saving. One is saving. You should save more. It's wise. It's prudent. You're taking care of yourself and you're taking care of your family when you save for the future. I'm in this sort of weird position now where I'm like old and my kids are 17 and 15 and 13. And all the hard decisions, well, first of all the bad choices I've made in life are kind of coming home to roost. You'll notice I'm probably carrying a little bit more around the middle than I need to. Furthermore, all the good choices I've made in life, a lot of those are kind of coming home to roost too. And one of the good choices my wife and I made is we saved. Okay, we saved pretty aggressively, and we're in a pretty comfortable position financially, such that we can do things like put new tires on the car if we need to. You should do more of that. But as we explain in the book, mere saving alone is not sufficient to explain how the West grew rich. First, because any increase in saving is not going to get us from, we'll back up again here to here plausibly. Second, saving rates in England, which is sort of the seat of the Industrial Revolution and the seat of the bourgeois deal and the seat of this great enrichment, were, if anything, lower than they were in other parts of Europe. Saving is simply piling up more and more and more of the same stuff, which again, I think is great and you should do more of it. However, piling up the same stuff repeatedly is going to run into a problem that economists call diminishing marginal returns. In the book, we talk about an example from a science writer named Matthew Ridley, who wrote a fantastic book in 2010 called The Rational Optimist. I strongly encourage everybody to read it. And in The Rational Optimist, he talks about how for our ancestors, for roughly 1 million years or so, used this thing that was called a hand axe. And it was basically a rock with a sharpened edge that you could hit something with and kill it, that you could use to slice stuff, that you could use to scrape blubber and fat off the inside of animal skins, and it was roughly the size of a human hand. Piling up more and more and more and more of these things is really not going to do much. Eventually, having one in each hand is not going to make you that much more productive. Turning, however, from something that fits in your hand like a little hand axe you can kill animals with to something that fits in your hand like a smartphone that you can search the internet and access any piece of information that the world has ever produced, basically, that you can now have real-time conversations with generative AI that does a pretty good job of answering the questions that you want it to answer. That's the stuff of the modern world. So saving, nice to have. You should do more of it, not the thing necessarily that caused the great enrichment. Another important thing that a lot of people talk about is science and technology. Science and technology. And science is great. Again, I love science. We should have more of it. Technology is great. I love technology. We should have more of it. However, the history of technology is basically us figuring out how to do something and then only later figuring out the basic science behind how it works. So I talked to one of the earlier classes about this, about the relationship between science and technology. Science tends to come after technology. Science tends to come after technology. A lot of you guys are athletes, I know. And I learned today that one of the lacrosse players does not do vector calculus on the field while he's passing the ball from one person to another. Now, you can if you want to, and you can use vector calculus to describe the flight of the ball and all this other wonderful stuff. But you can also be a pretty good lacrosse player without actually doing calculus while you're doing it. You don't need calculus to be able to bend it like Beckham, so to speak. You don't need calculus in order to be able to play soccer like Lionel Messi. Humans have been baking bread and cooking meat for as long as there have been people, and it's only been recently that we've figured out the food chemistry. Science is great. Science is wonderful. We should have more of it, but basic science, we argue, is not ultimately what caused the Great Enrichment. Okay. Those are a couple of good things, a couple of nice things to have that don't, again, get the job done. A third thing that's very, very nice to have, but that also doesn't get the job done is the railroad. You might have heard the story in high school about how we rode the iron horse from coast to coast, and it increased agricultural productivity, and it created the steel industry, and we had this multiplier effect, and the railroads are what caused American industrialization, except for the fact that there are a lot of substitutes for moving something by rail. And one of those substitutes is moving something by water. The economic historian Robert Fogel, who won the Nobel Prize in 1993, did so in part for the work he did showing that railroads contributed maybe a few percentage points to gross domestic product. A few percentage points are nice to have because, again, you can move stuff by water instead of by rail. But they're not the stuff of revolutionary changes in standards of living like those that we've enjoyed over the last several centuries. So there's good stuff that happened we should have more of. We don't think necessarily caused it. There's also bad stuff that people attribute it to that it turns out didn't just not cause it, but actively held it back. Slavery, imperialism, colonialism. Slavery, imperialism, colonialism. Well, the West grew rich, it's said, because of slavery, because of imperialism, or because of colonialism. The historian Neil Ferguson, however, put it really, really well when he said that imperialism was the least original thing that Europeans did after 1492. Because if there's anything that is true about human beings, it is that we are absolutely horrible to one another pretty much all the time throughout all of history. We've been enslaving, colonizing, exploiting, imperializing one another for, again, pretty much as long as there have been people. The first time someone noticed something that someone else had that they wanted and smacked them on the head and took it, well, that again is basically the human story. And we went for millennia of slavery and imperialism and colonialism without any of this enslavement, any of this imperialism, any of this colonialism creating economic growth. It was only limited to about the last couple of centuries. If it could have been slavery or imperialism or colonialism, then the Great Enrichment, we argue, would have happened somewhere else, and it would have happened a lot longer ago than it actually did. Furthermore, again, if slavery, imperialism, and colonialism were the stuff of the Great Enrichment, then Portugal and Brazil would be the major industrial powers today, not England and the United States. The economic historian Paul Rohde, who teaches at the University of Michigan, wrote a brilliant paper a couple of years ago where he tried to estimate the amount of U.S. output in the antebellum era that touched slavery. Okay. Not that slavery necessarily completely caused, but that touched slavery. He tried to estimate the fraction of U.S. output that enslaved people in the antebellum era were responsible for producing, and the figure he came up with was 12.6%. 12.6%, which is a lot, okay? Which is a lot, but it's not nearly enough to create a great enrichment. And moreover, as we saw with the rebound of the cotton economy in the United States after the Civil War, slavery was not necessary or sufficient to produce any of this stuff. From the broad perspective of humanity, slavery, imperialism, and colonialism might have enriched some specific people. Cecil Rhodes, for example, or people who owned plantations in Mississippi. In 1860, Mississippi was home to more millionaires than anywhere else in the country in 1860. But slavery, imperialism, and colonialism did not enrich entire societies. In fact, the return on investment in empire was negative relative to the alternatives. Okay, so enough of what didn't cause it. What did? What did cause it? What did lead to this great enrichment? We argue in Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich that it was a change in rhetoric, a change in ethics, and a change in ideas. People came to value innovation and new and novel and better and new and improved. This came to be something that people saw as being a dignified and sort of okay and perhaps even honorable thing to do. They came to value prudence as opposed to mere heroic gestures. How many of you guys are majoring in business in some form or fashion? Right, a lot of folks are majoring in business. How many of you have had at least one person in your life say, that's probably a good idea? That's probably good. Yeah. Okay, it's probably a good idea. Yeah. Why? You major in accounting? You major in finance? Congratulations. Welcome to the middle class. You're going to get a job. You're going to get a job. The arts and humanities are great. I love the arts. I love the humanities. You should study the arts. You should study the humanities. You should learn a new language. There's all sorts of other wonderful stuff. But we live in a society now that values this kind of prudence in ways that previous generations in other places would not have. To go to college, for most of history, would have been, okay, you're going to get a job in the church, or you're going to get a job in the bureaucracy, and you're going to control people. Here, in the United States in the year 2025, we encourage people to go to college so that they can develop skills that will help them get a job so they can provide for their families. And moreover, everybody wants to be a disruptor. Everybody wants to be a disruptor. Innovation historically meant heresy. It meant introducing heretical and unorthodox readings of Scripture. Today, innovation means introducing cool new stuff. Going into business. Okay? Not that business people as such are more honest than they used to be, but that we have come to value and honor people going into business, becoming accountants, going into finance, going into marketing, etc., in ways that, again, previous generations didn't. And if you look at some of the changes in not just English, but other European languages and how they treat words like innovation and novelty and their synonyms, you start to see these coming to describe more business-ish or business-like types of undertakings and types of endeavors. You have the development of the business school. You have the development of schools of engineering. You have, once again, people lionizing and looking up to not necessarily kings and generals and rulers, but people like Steve Jobs, who came up with really cool, really interesting, innovative stuff. People like Jeff Bezos, who created the greatest store that the world has ever seen. People who have introduced something that is new and improved and made other people's lives better. One of the examples I used in one of the classes I talked to earlier today was from my hometown, Birmingham, Alabama, which has a great food scene and a great beer scene. It wasn't always this way. In the 2000s, a group of people got together. They created something called the Free the Hops movement in Birmingham. And the goal was to change alcohol regulation in Alabama to make microbreweries microbreweries and basically any brewing operations legal in the state of Alabama. Now, of course, one member of the state legislature said in response, well, what's wrong with the beer we already have? What's wrong with Bud Light? What's wrong with Miller Lite? What's wrong with Natural Light? What's wrong with the beer we already have? Someone could reply, well, nothing necessarily. Nothing's wrong with the beer that we already have, but maybe we want to try something new. Maybe we think we can improve on it. Maybe we think that people don't want to drink Bud Light, Natural Light, Miller Lite all the time. Fortunately, the Free the Hops movement succeeded. Historically, the people screaming at the innovators, hey, what's wrong with the beer we have now, were a lot louder than the people saying, hey, let's try something new. That has changed. That has switched today. And now, while we do thwart innovation at least a little bit, we're much more open to it than we've been historically. Another example would be Uber. Uber and Lyft, ride sharing. I can't imagine life without ride sharing now. Up until 2015, I couldn't imagine life with it. So let's talk for a few minutes before we wrap up about changes in a sector that I've done a lot of research on that I know a thing or two about, and that's retail. That's retail. So we talked about Walmart, Talked a little bit ago about Meijer. The first self-service grocery store was Piggly Wiggly in Memphis, Tennessee. This guy named Clarence Saunders had an idea in 1916. He thought, maybe instead of people going into the store and telling the guy behind the counter, go fetch me these things, people would like to walk around the store themselves, get their own items, and then check out at a cash register. People thought he was crazy. He started Piggly Wiggly. He became insanely rich. Why? Because people voted with their money for self-service shopping. He became very, very rich and changed the way that people shop. Michael J. Cullen had an idea. Michael J. Cullen had an idea. He was an executive. He was an executive for the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. And he thought, you know what? I don't think grocery stores are big enough. Instead of just markets, I think we should have a supermarket. And in 1930, again, everyone thought he was crazy. The AMP people thought he was crazy. In 1930, he opened a store called King Cullen in Jamaica, New York, the world's first supermarket. And then in the 1950s, Life magazine later had an article about how the supermarket had completely taken over America. Michael Cullen's crazy, say the experts, say the people who are kind of looking at and evaluating what he's trying to do. However, the people, hoi polloi, voting with their money, thought that Michael J. Cullen was onto something. General Robert E. Wood had an idea. He worked for Montgomery Ward. In the first part of the 20th century, the mail order houses were all the rage. The mail order houses were all the rage. You get the Sears Wish Book or the Montgomery Ward catalog or the Marshall Fields catalog. General Robert E. Wood thought, you know what we ought to do is we ought to open stores in big cities. Because people aren't really doing the mail order thing as much. They're going and they're shopping in these big stores. Let's open some stores. And the people at Montgomery Ward said, you're crazy. And if I remember correctly, I think they fired him. Okay, I've got it in my notes. Okay, Sears and Roebuck hired him. And Sears and Roebuck became, as a result, the biggest retailer in the country. By implementing his idea, he changed fundamentally the way that people shopped. This guy named Eugene Fairclough in New York, he had an idea. He thought, you know what, people like shopping, okay, but they also don't like paying high prices. Turns out, however, that there's a loophole where if I'm running a store, I can't cut prices below what the fair trade laws require. I can, however, if I create a membership store, then offer goods at discounts. So we created a store called EJ Corvettes, where if you walked in, you were handed a membership card when you walked in the door, and you could buy at very, very, very deep discounts. In 1962, he was on the cover of Time magazine, which explained that discount retailing had suddenly become respectable. He again changed the way that people do things. Saul Price had an idea. He was a lawyer in San Diego, California, and sort of a consummate entrepreneur. And a couple of people he did work for dealt in liquor and watches. And they took a trip up from San Diego to meet with some of their clients who ran a store called Fedco in Los Angeles, which catered exclusively to federal employees. And Saul Price and his friends noticed that a lot of people were making this drive from San Diego to LA just to shop at Fedco. He said, hey, this would work, we think, in San Diego. Can we open a Fedco in San Diego? And the Fedco people said no. He started his own store, called it Fed Mart, and succeeded wildly. Later, he would get forced out of his own company by some investors. Not to be deterred, he and his son Robert started a store called Price Club and invented basically the modern discount warehouse club, which offers about 2,500 stock keeping units and relies very heavily on turnover. Hendrik Meijer had an idea. He was a Dutch immigrant and a socialist. He came over to the United States and he wanted to do socialism and be all involved in socialist political activism. That didn't really work very well, so Hendrik Meijer had a better idea. He started a store called imaginatively Meijer. And in 1962, he thought, you know what would be great? You know what would probably work? What if we took like a general merchandise retailing outlet and mashed it together with a grocery store and created a super store? Not just a supermarket, but a super store. And in 1962, He opened Myers Thrifty Acres, which was the first modern superstore. Okay. Later to be imitated by Target, Kmart, Walmart, and others. Sam Walton had an idea. He thought, hey, discount retailing is working for this Corvette or this Faircloth guy at EJ Corvettes, and this Saul Price chap over in San Diego seems to be doing pretty well, and some other folks seem to be doing okay. You know what? Maybe discount retailing will work in the middle of nowhere, rural America, like the corner of Arkansas. Maybe if I put a giant superstore in the county seat of middle of nowhere, Missouri, it will do really, really well. And people thought he was crazy. When he was trying to hire new people, he would make a job offer, and then they would go to their employers and say, hey, this Sam Walton guy, he's offered me a job. His employers would say, and their employers would say, okay, if you want to ruin your life, go ahead and go with this Walton chap. Okay. And then he became the richest man in America by the middle of the 1980s by betting on this idea, that discount retailing would work in rural America. Jeffrey Brotman had an idea. He saw Price Club and said, this works really, really well. I wonder if a Price Club would work in Seattle. So he approached the Price Club people and said, would you like to open a store in Seattle? They said, no, we don't want to open a store in Seattle. So he hired Saul Price's right-hand man, a guy named Jim Senegal, and he opened his own store in Seattle called Costco. Then in the early 1990s, Costco and Price Club merged and changed again. Big discount warehouse retailing. Jeff Bezos had an idea that, again, everybody thought was crazy. He presented it at Harvard Business School. They said, you better sell out to Barnes & Noble. A cover story on Barron's magazine in 1998 referred to what it called Amazon.bomb. Here's this idiot, Bezos, who thinks he can sell books on the internet. What a fool. And now, Amazon will probably, within the next few years, overtake Walmart as the biggest company in the world. All of these people had ideas. All of these people had the right to try. That's the important thing. They didn't have to prove themselves before the Railroad Unification Board or the Retail Unification Board or the experts. They didn't have to answer, what is it for, before a bunch of people who are kind of standing and stroking their chin and saying, well, I don't know what that is for necessarily. Indeed, that was a question that a lot of people asked at the unveiling of the iPad. What is it for? Steve Jobs probably couldn't tell you. Now, we live in a world where people can't imagine life without tablets and screens and iPhones and laptops and all sorts of other things. We had a society where people had the freedom and the liberty to try new things in retail, and they changed the lives of every single person in this room. They changed people's lives in such a way as to make it so that going to one of these places, a Meijer or a Walmart, would probably be the best way to show Joan of Arc how radically different our world is from hers. I'm going to close with 2 points. and I'm going to invoke two people that you should look up a little bit later. The ultimate resource. The ultimate resource. According to the economist Julian Simon, the ultimate resource is the creative human mind. The ultimate resource is the creative human mind. There are no limits, he argues, to economic growth because we can constantly come up with new, better ways to do things. We can come up with new, better ways to retail. We can come up with new, better ways to ship. Okay. There's no limits to economic growth because there's no limit to the way that we can recombine new ideas. When we have free minds possessed by free people in free markets, which adapts the slogan of Reason magazine, we get long-run economic growth and unparalleled prosperity. Second person I want to invoke, second concept I want to invoke, the economist Thomas Sowell. When I grow up, I want to be Thomas Sowell. He just turned 95 years old. Okay, he keeps writing books still, somehow. He's famous for saying there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. In a society that has recognized these trade-offs and that has let people identify and evaluate their own trade-offs with reference to the value of a good that they might look at compared to the value of what's in their wallet, or the value of a good that they might have on offer compared to what people are willing to pay, we've gotten modern prosperity. We've gotten a world where there are a lot of people We live for a very, very long time. We have access to goods and services unlike anything our ancestors could have possibly imagined. We live in a very, very, very different world. I'm happy now to answer questions for pretty much as long as you guys will have me. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Matchak. Thank you all very much for your time and attention.
And thank you, Professor Carden. So there are some index cards that were circulated before the lecture. And if you have a question, please write it on one of those cards and someone will come around to collect those. I have a few to start with here. So here's a question to start with. Do you think contemporary American culture is generally supportive of the bourgeois deal? What signs should we look for as evidence of that?
That's a great question. And so this actually speaks to a question that someone wrote that we didn't get to in one of the earlier classes, where someone asked, "What if you could add another chapter to the book? What would it be?" Actually, make a note to myself because Professor McCloskey and I have another book coming out next year called "Mind Your Own Business: The Obvious and Simple System of Natural Liberty." Maybe we should add this chapter to that. But the chapter I would add would ask exactly this question and say, well, what do we need to know to see whether the United States at least sort of, kind of, maybe a little bit adopts the bourgeois deal? And one piece of evidence I've looked at a little bit that we didn't put in the book is what people are majoring in college. So the history of, like I said, the history of the business school, the history of the School of Engineering. So these are two areas where improvement is kind of unambiguously baked into it. So more people majoring in business because it's prudent and wise to do so. A society that embraces business as not necessarily a perfect thing to do, but at least as a reasonable and decent thing to do, I think is a piece of evidence. There are a lot of people who reject the bourgeois deal. Okay? A lot of people who reject the bourgeois deal, and they're very, very loud about it. But I think on net, we still embrace it. We still embrace it. And one piece of evidence I would look at would again be what people are majoring in college. The second piece of evidence that, again, we looked at but didn't make it into the book is circulation of different publications. Circulation of different publications. The Wall Street Journal is it either has the highest or the second highest circulation of any newspaper in the country. And it is fundamentally, obviously, a business paper. In fact, yesterday there was a really great section that I need to read about the development of the American economy. So looking at the kinds of publications people are reading. I write a lot, or have written a lot in the past for Forbes.com, looking and seeing what magazines are circulating. You've got celebrity gossip magazines like People and Us, which, okay, I guess if that's what you're into. But then you also have magazines like Business Week and now the website Business Insider and Forbes and Fortune and all these other things. These I would take as evidence that the bourgeois deal is at least being somewhat embraced. And then finally, web traffic. Which websites are the ones that are getting the most traffic? Which videos on YouTube are the ones that are getting the most views? Are they consistent with the hypothesis that we have embraced, at least to a certain extent, the bourgeois deal? That's a great question. Yeah, I think that would be a very good chapter. Okay, in fact, I'm going to write that down.
Okay, so our next question, how should we balance economic freedom with concerns about sustainability or inequality?
Ooh, how should we balance, let's see, chapter on business adoption. How should we balance economic freedom with concerns about sustainability and inequality? Okay, so I'm going to give a couple of answers to this. First, problems of quote unquote unsustainability are largely a result of our failure to leave one another alone. It's our meddling in each other's affairs. So I was talking with Dr. Takarev earlier about energy. And the cleanest available source of energy right now is nuclear. Everything should be, in my opinion, and I'm not a scientist necessarily, but if you look at like deaths per kilowatt hour for nuclear, it is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of deaths per kilowatt hour for any other energy source. And yet, largely because of the Chernobyl disaster in the 1980s, which happened in a communist country, people are afraid of nuclear energy. This is not without its consequences. I'm going to go back to my Thomas Sowell slide here. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. In 2011, I think there was a disaster in Japan with the Fukushima nuclear reactor. And as a result, Germany basically banned nuclear power. Said, by God, we're going to stop the nukes. We're going to stop nuclear power. We're going to go back to coal. Okay. Well, it turns out that nuclear power is super duper clean and that it doesn't produce any particulate matter. Some economists, and we talk about this in Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, some economists look at the data and estimated an additional 31,000 deaths due to particulate matter in the air from coal-fired power plants in Germany. So largely, I think a lot of the sustainability problems come from the fact that we are not actually leaving one another alone. We're subsidizing a lot of really, really destructive stuff. Inequality has a slightly more complicated answer. The first and the most hard-hearted of the answers is I don't think that inequality is morally important. Full stop. I do not, in my heart of hearts, I do not believe that economic inequality is morally important. The fact that someone else has more than me does not matter, because them having more than me almost certainly did not cause me to have less than them. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, all of them, yeah, sure, they get government subsidies and things like that, but by and large, they owe their fortunes to innovation. Another reason why I don't think inequality is morally important is, again, something we talked about in one of the classes earlier today. The economist William Nordhaus estimated that about 98% of the value of innovation has accrued not to the innovators themselves, but to us in the form of gains from trade, in the form of candy canes and smartphones and all sorts of really cool, interesting stuff. Okay, so it's not really clear to me what else they could possibly owe if we're already getting 98% of the value of what's being created. That's the hard-hearted answer. That's a hard-hearted answer. The more soft-hearted answer, and again, the one that we talk about in the book, asks whether income inequality is really the right measure. And here we borrow from my advisor in graduate school, an economic historian named John Nye, who pointed out that the characteristics of the goods available to the poor are very close substitutes for the characteristics of the goods available to the very, very rich. The difference between being carted around in a horse-drawn carriage versus slogging along on foot through the mud is much, much larger than the difference between driving a Lexus and driving a Toyota. So one of the arguments that Nye makes is that income is misleading as a measure of genuine and meaningful inequality because the goods available to the poor are such close substitutes for the goods available to the rich. Second, and this is again another part of Nye's argument, is there's something called a positional good. There's something called a positional good. There can only be one best restaurant. Okay. There can only be one best restaurant. Okay. And as people get richer and richer and richer, and they're competing for spots at the best restaurant, then prices at that restaurant are likely to go up. In a sense, that's kind of a tax on effort. That's kind of a tax on the very, 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 very wealthy. So access to positional goods might change, access to positional goods means that some inequality is fundamentally irreducible. Now, to make it more to make it a little bit more concrete, so I teach at a historically Baptist university, which means that none of my students drink in front of each other. And those of you here who I'm sure maybe one of you might know somebody who does or who will occasionally imbibe of intoxicating liquors will know that there's some whiskeys and some scotches and some brown liquors you can buy from the bottom shelf, which are really, really, really cheap. Really cheap. Now that I haven't checked this out recently, but as of the time we wrote the book, the most expensive bottle of liquor ever sold was a bottle of Macallan Scotch that went for, I think, $625,000. I think that's the number we used in the book. $625,000. Now, it's been a long time since I've been to a liquor store. But I can't imagine, so let's see here, you can buy like a $10 bottle of rot gut Scotch versus a $625,000 bottle of Macallan. Is it really 62,500 times better? I'm not sure that it is. Dwayne Johnson can buy the $625,000 bottle of Scotch. Jeff Bezos can buy the $625,000 bottle of Scotch. It's not really clear that it's that much better than what some of you are hiding in your dorm rooms right now.
Okay. There's a
Hey,
lot of
I went to
pessimism.
college. I know this works.
Seems to be some pessimism and anxiety amongst Gen Z about achieving the American dream or
Yeah.
living as well as their parents. Is it likely that they will see the same kind of improvements as previous generations?
A qualified yes. So the yes is you will be better off than your parents. The qualification is you will not be as well off as you could have been had we not made a bunch of boneheaded policy mistakes over the last couple of 100 years. Social Security, just to use one example, don't count on it. My wife and I have made all of our plans assuming we'll get nothing from Social Security. Maybe that's a little bit too conservative, but right now Social Security is insolvent. There are tens of trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities. One of two things has to happen. Either benefits have to be cut or taxes have got to go up. One of those two things. Second though, progress is incremental, and it might not look like much from day to day to day to day to day to day to day, but if you put it together over a few years, it really starts to become kind of substantial. Another name you should write down is Jeremy Horpedahl, Horpedahl. He's writing a book for Harvard University Press right now, explaining that you guys actually have it better than any generation before and will have it better going forward. And it's primarily a data-driven approach. Now then, does that mean that everything is wine and roses? No, it doesn't. Okay, it doesn't. And again, like I said, there are some serious mistakes we've made. One of the big problems facing your generation is homeownership. Okay. Homeownership. Houses, you might have noticed, are very, very expensive, and they're getting more expensive more rapidly. One of the reasons for this is because we passed a lot of laws in a bunch of different places, making it extremely difficult to build new housing. And in particular, 3 metro areas in the country, Boston, New York, and the San Francisco Bay Area, are where the gap between the housing we should be building and the housing we are building is largest. But that's a policy mistake. That's something we can fix. We can change the rules to make it easier to build new housing, and that would alleviate a lot of those problems.
Okay, a quote from your book, you say materialism is a danger to the soul.
Yeah.
And the question is, how should we view the increase in our wealth? What is wealth, and how should we view it?
That's a really good question. That's a really, really good question. How does the invisible hand handle wealth? How should we think about money? How should we think about the fact that we are so much richer than our ancestors were? I think one, we should think about it gratefully. We should think about it gratefully because living in a world where we have the resources and the opportunities we have is pretty nice. Second, I think we should try to do so soberly and faithfully. So I'm a Christian. I'm one of the elders at our church. I actually preached on Sunday. And one of the things I'll regularly tell my students at Samford, our Baptist university, and one thing I regularly tell a bunch of other people is, okay, yeah, sure, you take Joan of Arc to Meyer and you show her how radically different and better our lives are than those available to her and any of her contemporaries. You do that. But if you're looking for existential meaning, if you're looking for deep soul satisfaction on the snack food aisle at Walmart or Meijer, you're looking in the wrong place. Okay, you're looking in the wrong place. I love stuff, okay, as much as the next person, but stuff definitely has its place. And there's no quantity of sugar or candy canes or baseball cards, which I've gotten back into, that you can buy that will fill that God-shaped hole in your soul. For that, go to church, take literature classes. Those would be my recommendations.
Okay, and I think that this will be the final question tonight.
Okay.
If you had to pick one simple lesson from the book for young people to remember, what would it be?
One simple lesson from the book. I'm going to say that the simple lesson came out of the book and led into my most recent book. So I tell my students at Samford, if I were going to put, and a lot of this is driven by the work that McCloskey and I did in Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. If I were going to put my life's philosophy on a bumper sticker, it would be 4 words. Make more, take less. Make more, take less. Produce more. Do what God has set before you to do. Do your job. And again, we talked about this a little bit earlier in one of the earlier classes. At a Baptist school, I'm surrounded by students who are like constantly worried about what's God's will for my life? What is God's will for my life? Oh my gosh, what's God's will for my life? And finally I said, look, no, God's will for your life is for you to go to class. God's will for your life is for you to go to class. God's will for your life is for you to do the reading. God's will for your life is for you to show up to class on time. God's will for your life is for you to show up to practice on time, and then all the other stuff will follow from that. So do the small stuff, produce more, and then the take less part. I did say that saving didn't create the great enrichment, but more saving can make us richer. It frees up resources available for people who want to start new businesses, who want to produce new stuff, who want to try new things. So at a very, very, very concrete level, do a little bit more for whatever you want to do with your life. So if you want to go into accounting, study a little bit harder. If you go into finance, study a little bit harder. Learn a little bit more so that over your lifetime, you're better at your job and can produce a little bit more. And the second thing is going to be to just take less. Buy a few fewer baubles. And when you're spending, try to do so deliberately, try to do so intentionally, try to do so at least somewhat reverently. Okay? And note, I say this as someone who just yesterday bought 2 tickets to see the opening of Jiu-Jitsu Kaizen with my 13-year-old on Thursday. So maybe if we're going to have another bumper sticker, I'd put and have a little bit of fun with it. Okay? So if that's the last question, I think we can go ahead and disperse and go get brownies and cupcakes and stuff. Thank you again for your attention. You've been a lovely audience.
Just a few thank yous before we do go get those brownies and cookies. First, before I do thank a few people, for those of you who are recording your attendance for Impact or for a course, the QR codes will be dispersed through the lobby in Upper Griswold, so don't walk past those on your way to the cookies. I'd first like to start by thanking 2 individuals who have made the Freedom Seminar possible, Dr. Dale Matchuk and Dr. Alex Tokarov. I would also like to thank the Omniquest Selection Committee, which was led by Dr. Kristen Stahauer, who was our Academic Vice President and Provost. The committee members were Dr. Dale Matchuk, Dr. Alex Tokarov, and Dr. Gabriel Benzikri. The opportunity to submit Omniquest selections will be coming soon for the 26-27 academic year. Please be sure to keep an eye out for that form that will be announced via NU today. The entire NU community is invited to nominate books that reinforce one or more of the following criteria: the Northwood idea, community building, personal enrichment, leadership, or career readiness. And finally, but most importantly for this evening, please join me in extending a special thank you to Art Carden for coming to campus today and bringing our Omniquest selection to life and our final Freedom Seminar event for this year.
Yay, cookies.